Teachers, what was the worst thing a substitute teacher did while you were gone? Story 1, when I was a substitute, I got a lot of requested jobs because the substitute pool was poor. One such example given to me was a substitute who would just go to sleep. I barely believed it. Once I was teaching full-time, I had a sub come in for a day. When I got back, my students told me that he told them to leave him alone, sat down, and went to sleep. I believed it then. Story 2, I would occasionally give out Starbursts to my 4th graders, ate all the pink ones. I was a teacher's assistant while in college. The teacher and I took a week-long workshop and had a sub. The worst thing she did, not letting the kids go potty. It was in kindergarten, and she said all the kids go to bathroom were interrupting the class. One girl wet herself. School policy was if kids under a certain age had an accident, the nurse would give them a pull-up, basically a diaper to wear. The substitute proceeded to make fun of the girl for wearing a diaper, calling her baby and such. The little girl ended facing repercussions at home too. This was devastating to hear about. Story 3, I came back after being gone one day, and my students told me the substitute teacher flipped over tables in a rage and was escorted from the building by a cop. What actually happened is that the sub left the room to take a 20-minute phone call, and the kids thought it would be funny to flip the tables over. The substitute then had to flip the tables right side up while yelling at the kids. Then during lunch, my special ed co-teacher came into my room to set up and caught the sub making out with a student. Turns out she was 18 to his 25, and the 20-minute phone call was to set up the lunch meeting. The principal then had him escorted from the building by the resource officer. This is why I say having a sub is more work than just coming into school myself. Edit wrong version of principal. Story 4, gave out snacks I bought with my own money that I kept for kids who stayed after to get tutoring. Threw out a broken electric pencil sharpener that kids broke in front of her, which again I bought with my own money and couldn't get replaced by the company because I had no product to send back. I still don't have a sharpener for my room. Let the kids go through my things in my cabinets and desk. Lost a bunch of stuff that way. Story 5-1. Asked a deaf kid to take off his hearing aids. Kids tried to tell her he needs to them, but to her they look like headphones. She cried when was confronted by another teacher too. When I was in 6th grade, I fractured my wrist, but it was my dominant hand, so I had to poorly write with my right. Teacher forced me to write with my left while I had a cast. I couldn't even grasp the pencil. Cried a lot. Then a couple months go by and got my cast off. Sub told me to it up and write with my left hours after getting my cast off. I felt like jelly in intense pain. Teacher was fired at the end of 7th grade because of unnecessary complaints. Edit, I should have realized this was a teacher's question, not a student cue. This is considered my first post that I really thought wouldn't get noticed, and now my inbox is full of messages. To clear some questions, I would never steal someone's story, and both stories are very true, but probably be something similar you have encountered before. Also, the teacher should know how to treat students in any situation whatsoever. If teachers really hate their jobs, don't include kids into it. I remember crying asking my mom, why does my teacher pick on me or make me do things I couldn't do? Story 6, accused a student of stealing something that the aide had put away. This was a class that contained some pretty rough students, including one suspended multiple times for fighting and some gang members. She decided to go after a sweet, petite girl that never caused trouble and was generally popular with her classmates. This set off the entire class, which is when the sub went ballistic and started wildly throwing accusations and yelling at said students. Security eventually got called and took several students out. My first clue was when the sub got my cell number from the staff directory and went off for 20 minutes about how bad my students had been. This was followed up with an extremely long email and a 2-page written note on my desk, plus a concern note from the administrator about not having appropriate sub-plans. She didn't follow them in the first place and decided to throw me under the bus. The next morning when I arrived at school, the students were waiting for me at the door. Once I got them calmed down enough to tell their side of the story, we had a discussion on how they could have handled the situation differently. I promised them never to get that sub again. On a related note, I had a good relationship with said rough children because I treated them with respect and fairness. They usually behaved for me. Story 7, this happened to my colleague, but I was the classroom next door. My colleague was showing Clash of the Titans at the end of the year after Unit on Ancient Greece. There's mild nudity at the beginning and the end of the movie, but they were in the middle of the movie, so there shouldn't have been an issue. He left the video paused at the right spot. We still had VCRs like 10 years ago when this happened, but the sub somehow managed to show both the nudity at the beginning and the end of the movie. The nudity scenes were hours apart, and the class was only 40 minutes. Then, the sub wrote an email to the principal about how my colleague made him show nudity. Story 8, didn't do anything to the kids, per se, but told the kids that the reason I was out was because my mom was having breast cancer surgery. I teach K-5, and I specifically didn't tell the kids because I didn't want them to worry. So when I came back, I had a bunch of kids come up to me asking about my mom, which was so sweet, but not something the kids should have had to worry about. Story 9, rearranged my room. Not in a move student A away from student B and put her by student C way, in a move the giant rug over to the opposite corner of the room and completely change the layout of student desks and rearrange a bookshelf way. Story 10, lost more than half of my textbooks that I purchased myself. As well as textbooks that were school property, administration just shrugged at this until they found out the textbooks belonging to the school were around $120 each. Also lost all the book assignments of 4 classes I asked them to collect so I could correct those at home. Kinda sucked for the students who did put a lot of work on it and didn't have digital copies. Also didn't teach anything that I asked him to because he didn't really like the subject matter. Also didn't bother grading. When I checked the grades he had given out, there was only 1 grade and everyone was given 810, even students that didn't take my class. Story 11, she let the kids run wild and do whatever they wanted. First graders. I was out because my dad died. Thank God my team realized what happened and all pulled together and cleaned the room, put it back together before I returned to work. Story 12, not a teacher, but the sub made the handicapped classmate who has muscle, joint, and vision complications go grab his textbook from his homeroom. He's not completely helpless, but when it comes to heavy things, he needs help. Classmate's homeroom was halfway across campus, and the required book consists of 5 large text volumes. Because they're specifically made for his poor vision, he can't wear glasses either due to complications. I offered to help because I'm usually the one that goes and grabs it for him during normal class, but the sub yelled at me, saying he knows my kind and I'm just trying to get out of class. Sub told me he's not there to play games and for me to quit it before he sends me off to the principal's office. Needless to say, the entire class was shocked. Classmate came back with another student from the homeroom requesting that next time the sub send someone else to grab the books because my classmate can't carry it by himself. When my usual teacher came back, we requested the sub not return because of what he said to us and did to classmate. My teacher wrote an email to the principal about it, and that was the end of that. Story 13, not a teacher, but in 9th grade my algebra teacher had her baby early in the year, so she was gone to the last month or 2 months of the school year. The sub was a former teacher, so you think she'd be a great sub. Nope. She hyper-focused on 3 to 4 out of the 28 students in the class, and just teach them while completely ignoring the rest of us. She'd pass out a worksheet, then go to her students and never acknowledge us again till she dismissed us. Never checked homework, never acknowledged us. If anyone outside of her favorite students raised their hand or spoke up, they were ignored, etc., which went about as well as you expected with a bunch of 14 to 15-year-olds. That class was just wild. The kids who actually stayed in the classroom anyway. It was a mess. I'm actually surprised we weren't reported or visited by the teachers on either side of us for how loud we were. After several months with this lady, the vice principal was walking around randomly checking classrooms and walked into our show algebra class. He lost it, yelled at all of us to sit down and shut up, which she also didn't acknowledge. Demanded she leave and sat with us the rest of the period, never saw her again, and had maybe 6 to 7 different subs after her. 2 weeks after this, our regular teacher came back. When she realized we had learned nothing and learned the extent of how useless this lady had been, she started tearing up. I passed the classroom on the way to the bathroom during the next period and saw her sobbing at her desk. A friend of my mom's worked at the central office where they assigned or organized the substitute teachers. That lady was permanently taken off the substitute list. Story 14, had a substitute teacher in my high school French class show a movie that was straight up softcore pornography, but tried to explain that since it was in French, it was artistic. It was equally frustrating because while I wanted to see, I also couldn't stop reading the subtitles because I had to understand what they were saying. The teacher did not come back the next day. Update, I went through all the comments and looked at everyone who suggested what movie it might be, and none of those movies were the ones shown. This would have been in 2006, and the movie looked maybe late 90s or early 2000s. If I come across it, I will update this thread, but for all I know, it could have been in French. Story 15, not a teacher, but a student with a story. Nonetheless, meet Mrs. Hostess, fake name Avi. Every time my 8th grade history teacher was out, Mrs. Hostess would usually sub for him, not sure why, because she subbed other classes too, but all the incidents of note happened when she subbed for history. When there happened to be a girl in the class who shared a name with an Irish folk song, every time Mrs. Hostess took attendance, when she got a folk song girl, she sang the whole song, every time, too. The history teacher kept candy and snacks in his desk. Lollipops, that head handout for correct answers, or just because some leftover Halloween candy, and the Twinkie was not an ordinary Twinkie. The Twinkie was an experiment in processed food. This Twinkie was still in its original individual packaging and looked normal at first glance, but was actually 3 years past expiration and rock solid. The history teacher demonstrated this by standing on the Twinkie during one of the first weeks of classes, all said to say, "This is a thoroughly inedible Twinkie." So Mrs. Hostess subbed again, and we knew she'd discovered the lollipop stash because she was openly eating them during class. But it wasn't until the next day that our history teacher opened his desk drawer to find that the Twinkie was gone. This woman ate an expired, solid Twinkie, as well as literally all the food candy in the teacher's desk. Story 16, not a teacher. But in the 4th grade, our teacher had a baby and was gone for several weeks. The sub we had was an absolute witch. She had no patience for kids. She'd yell at us for stupid, ask us questions, or give us homework that was way above our tiny 4th grade brain levels, and then complain and call us stupid when literally none of the kids did well on the work. One girl decided to get smart with her one day, and she walks over and slaps the girl hard across the face, which of course sends a girl into a hysterical sobbing fit, and says that's what you're of a mother should be doing more often, being tiny, adorable 4th graders. We were all too afraid to tell anyone. We had to deal with that for 3 weeks until the main teacher came back. Story 17, back when I was a teacher, I had a sub decide my plans weren't good enough for her and went rogue. She decided to show my students videos of animals giving birth on YouTube. I taught English. Story 18, a few of the periods I taught were co-teach classes where a percentage of the students in the class have special needs, but can work well enough in a general population classroom with assistance from a special education co-instructor. These classes were often very rewarding to teach, but one downside of teaching that population from a logistical standpoint is that I was often required to attend ARD meetings. Basically, every special education student has a meeting about twice a year, sometimes more frequently depending on need, where administrators, teachers, counselors, parents, guardians, and the student themselves all get together to go over their status and review the various educational accommodations the student is receiving to determine what may or may not need to change to best suit their needs. I didn't have a problem with attending these meetings per se, but because they only take one period and several teachers are rotating through various meetings over the course of a day, the school had devoted ARD subs who were more akin to babysitters at best than substitute educators. That means that during that one period can randomly break loose. One year, I had a tough student who had some serious attitude problems, but was a good person underneath it all, and with whom I'd done a lot of work with to improve her engagement and interest in my class. About halfway through the year, I got called for an ARD meeting during the period I had said student. In my absence of 45 minutes, the sub decided to pick a petty argument with my kid, who was rightfully offended but unwisely overreacted and escalated things to making threats and nearly coming to blows with the sub, to where she ended up with in-school suspension for a while. Getting the story from all parties and witnesses involved later, it's pretty clear the sub was to blame, and the kid who ID worked so hard with was back at square one. I eventually got her back on track, and she ended up with one of the highest grades in my class at the end of the year, but I could only imagine how much better she could have been without the setback and the amount of trust in adults she'd lost. Story 19, I'm a little late to the party, but here's goes. I had a grade 12 class last year, and one student had diabetes. Let's call him Adam. So Adam had a cell phone that beeps when his blood sugar is too low high. It's connected to the monitor in his arm hip. The cell phone has no other uses, no apps, no data, not connected to the school Wi-Fi. The substitute saw his phone on his desk and promptly took it away as per the no devices rule. During gym class, an EA comes in to make sure everything is okay, and Adam is visibly ill, pale sweating the whole works. Luckily, this EA knows Adam's medical plan. Instantly asks the Adam for the phone, and he explains that the substitute took it away in the morning. The EA then loses IT on the substitute demanding the phone. The substitute calls on the principal to reprimand the EA, then get reprimanded herself, as obviously she did not read the student safety plans. She was asked to leave, and the principal taught the class the rest of the day. Adam was fine, drank a couple juice boxes, and had a granola bar. Mom picked him up shortly after. Story 22, things come to mind. 1. Tell the black children they need to speak more clearly, because people think black people are hard to understand. 2. Just sit and play on the phone while class loses its mind. Story 21, I had left out overnight eggs that I was going to use in a science experiment the following day. I was out and thought nothing about it. I returned the following day and went looking for the eggs only to find them missing. Asked the student where they went, and I was informed that the substitute took the class to the special education kitchen, hard-boiled them, and ate them. I went to talk to my AP and was informed that the sub had called in sick for her job for that day, due to food poisoning. Story 22, I had a cool Chinese lucky cat that went missing after I had a sub. My student said the sub seemed really intrigued by it, talked about it several times, and even moved it from the shelf where it sat and brought it over to my desk. It was gone when I returned the next day. Story 23 had a sub who somehow allowed a last period class of freshmen to convince him that they were not supposed to be working on the packet that I left for the class, and which every other class that day had been working on, because they had already finished it and told him they were supposed to be watching a movie. He went to the library to get the movie, leaving the class unattended, which promptly then broke out a dance party involving dancing on the desks. My department chair's classroom was next door, but as she taught AP government to seniors, she was able to leave them to come next door and try to figure out what was going on. No sub. She calmed the class down and into the seats and into the worksheets, and calls the principal, who met the sub on his way back from the library, and told him he could go home. My chair also found it would be appropriate to basically call me and blame me for this while I was sick at home. I don't teach anymore, lol. I mean, packets were not a great emergency subplan, but what can you do? They could have played heads up 7-up for all I cared, lol. They were a handful of a group on the best days, freshmen after lunch during last period of the day, our situation. Story 24, not a teacher, but I vividly remember one incident of having a substitute in kindergarten. I had an infected cut on my toe and had been prescribed an antibiotic. That morning was the first time I took it. We were sitting on the floor for roll call, and I remember this burning pain in my abdomen, and she told us to get up and go to out desks. I tried to get up only to realize I couldn't move, and just laid back. This sub was a total cow, and I remember she was always really mean. Anyway, she starts yelling at me for being attention-seeking, and basically tries to pull me up. I'm in so much pain, I start screaming, and one of the teachers from the classroom next to ours comes, realizes I'm not faking it, and calls an ambulance. Long story short, I'm horribly allergic to penicillin, and my kidneys were failing. I was in hospital for almost a week before I got discharged. Needless to say that absolute was not allowed back at the school, but I will never forget that day. Story 25, not a teacher, but we had a sub for our science class. She didn't believe in science, but pseudosciences was to males, and because of her weird diet would rip loud, sulfur-smelling farts all the time, then get mad if we brought it up despite being fed new-age hippie bullshit and being crop-dusted. She also was a horrible ed teacher, because she said women can choose when to have periods without birth control. Story 26, not a teacher, but I participate in STEM programs a lot. In the 90s, I belonged to a club that refurbished old industrial PCs and donated them to schools. Sometimes would get completely burned out motherboards or disk drives, so I took a bunch of those and made displays showing the insides of computers, and ID let the kids explore them as part of my session. Then ID dig out a couple of blown PCs and monitors, hand out the screwdrivers, and let them rip them apart. Yes, I was always careful around the old tube monitors. Once they were done ID, let them pick apart if they want to take home. The younger kids especially love this, and frequently I do see some kids take home a hard drive controller or a graphics card like it was a real treasure. I even made the local news with my program. That's the thing about living in a small city. Eventually everyone makes the news, so one day I went to do my lesson at a high school, I think freshman or sophomore science class. The class had a substitute, and I had an appointment right after that session, so I told them I'd come back to pick everything up the next day. The kids could take whatever they wanted from the old PCs, but please put my displays aside in the cupboard. Next day, I came by, and all my displays were still out, and they were completely trashed. Worse yet, the sub's attitude was, well, kids will be kids. That was the last session I did ever for that program. Story 27, way before most of you were born. It's May 1981. I have a bad cold and moving from an apartment to our first house, and my wife is due to give birth to our first child at any time. It's a Thursday. I write lesson plans for Friday and Monday. Remember, these are the days before cell phones or email. The plans are left on the front table of my classroom. Friday and Saturday are moving days. The new house is filled with boxes. We can't find anything. Sunday morning, my wife goes into labor. By Sunday night, our beautiful baby is born. Since I had left plans for Friday and Monday and informed the office I would let them know Monday of my plans for Tuesday, I wasn't worried about my classes, but on Monday morning, the phone rang in my wife's recovery room. It was the principal telling me the sub had bailed because whoever had subbed on Friday had thrown out the lesson plans, not realizing they were to be continued on Monday. The Monday sub probably rightly refused to work without plans. I didn't know the sub on Friday wasn't going to stick around for Monday. Again, with no email option, I couldn't just send new ones. The principal demanded that I return to school. The school was in a rural small community about 25 miles from the city where we lived and where the hospital was located. He wouldn't hear of me just telling him what the plans were to be. He demanded again that I drop everything and get down to school, which I did. Someone else later that day picked up my wife and son and drove them home to our house full of boxes. So I didn't get to have that experience. The principal called me in his office and lectured me. He said, "My wife had breast cancer surgery. You know what I did? I dropped her off at the hospital door and came to school because that is my job. I expect nothing less from you." Needless to say, we never really got along after that. I'm thankful that he retired a few years after that. And I went on to teach until 2008 and had a very good career, but it would have been much better if that substitute teacher had not thrown out my lesson plans that Friday afternoon. Story 28, my ninth grade English teacher was fired, which is an entire other story, and the school had difficulty finding someone to fill the spot. We would have random subs, but they didn't really teach us, so eventually we had a different person babysit us each day or week. One time, it was the very scary principal who just glared at us like we were convicts about to escape, the school's police officers who at least talked to us, and various teachers for one-day stints. I don't know why one of our 5 librarians couldn't have been there going through grade appropriate books at the least. We spent 2 to 3 months like that. Story 29, he yelled at one of the only girls in my high school engineering class, saying girls don't belong in engineering. He also kicked his feet up on the desk and read the paper the entire day. He banged a yardstick on a desk to get everyone's attention, then pointed it at the white boards with the daily objectives, all without saying a word. He disappeared at lunch and came back smelling like weed. These are all reports I got from my students the next day. This guy was a retired teacher too. Story 30, I've had so many bad subs. One sub made an elementary student cry, insisting her own name was misspelled, and made her stand up in front of the class and admit her name was spelled wrong. I asked that she not return, but I still saw her around as other teachers had her sub. Another one worth mentioning was supposed to be my sub for the last 2 weeks of school because I went on maternity leave, this time teaching at a 7th to 12th grade school. Ignored all my sub plans, played on his cell phone the whole time, and then like 3 days and got upset at the students and told them off. And then they watched as he walked out to the parking lot and drove away. Thank goodness some kids went and told the office. When I came back, it was like my room had been ransacked. It was awful. Story 31, she was brought in to teach history. What did she teach? Geography, like how the worksheets I left were literally on Hitler's rise to power. And I should have mentioned, she taught how earthquakes can cause tsunamis. Yes, it was interesting, but you had one job, and it wasn't that. Story 32, the first year I taught 5th grade. I really wanted to do something special for my students before Christmas vacation. I spoke with my team, and we came up with the idea to make every student a personalized Christmas ornament. We were going to surprise them by displaying the ornaments on a Christmas tree the day before vacation, and they would be able to take them home. I was gone for a department thing the day before we were going to set up the tree, and one of the least liked subs was scheduled for my class. Since I had stored all the ornaments in my closet, I simply asked if the students needed any supplies. Make sure to get them yourself and not let them see the surprise. The thing about this sub, and the reason she wasn't liked, was that her first line of defense was always threatened to take away something for misbehaving recess, free time, lunch, etc. I think you know where I'm going with this. Fast forward to the end of the day, I get back to my classroom in the last 30 minutes of class, so I could dismiss them when all of a sudden it met with 25 kids asking about their ornaments. I tried to play dumb and asked them what they were talking about. And of course they informed me the sub said something. She told the students about the ornaments and said if they misbehaved, she would tell me and I would take away their ornaments. Instantly, I was filled with horror that the surprise was ruined for all 5th grade their kids. They told the whole grade during recess, anger because that sub ruined the surprise, sad disappointment, because I really wanted to see their faces when they walked through the door the next day and saw a special Christmas tree with their personalized ornament. It's not the biggest deal or anything, but I was really upset that weekend. To this day, when I talk to my old partners, I still refer to her as the Grinch. Story 33, I had a sub give out my cell phone number to my high school students, so they could call me and give me excuses as to why they weren't taking their test while I was gone. I was livid. I complained to the sub office, and that teacher never subbed for my building again. Story 34, student here. TLDR sub demanded I turn over my heart monitor in front of the class. Junior year, I was having major heart problems and had to wear a heart monitor 15 hours a day. It had a phone attached that when I had heart murmurs, it would send the data to my doctor. I was wearing it and started having heart issues. It buzzed, and I went to click send when the sub demanded I turn over my cell phone. I started to explain why I couldn't, and she snapped at me. So I lifted my shirt to show the wires and sensors strapped to my chest. In front of the class of 50 students, choir class, I've never seen anyone's face drop that fast in my life. Story 35 was a student. Our maths teacher went on leave for a while. I think maternity and the supply teacher was absolutely useless. Had been given one topic to teach us, and that was it for weeks. We had a whole textbook to be working through, and I was going to take my math GCSE a year early. But no, we just did a topic our class had got the hang of in a week for 2 or 3 months because I guess he didn't know or bother to ask what we were supposed to be doing next. So the rest of the year, we had to go ahead of the pace. We were expecting to be able to cover everything we had to know, supply teachers, not a teacher, but in elementary school I had a nose during class and asked to use the restroom. She said no and refused to let me go to the restroom. I think she didn't believe me. I sat there until the blood had spilled all over the desk, then raised my hand to be excused, and only then did she allow me to go clean myself up. She even had the audacity to ask me why I didn't ask to be excused earlier, which was a complete lie, as she definitely heard me the first time, and even the other students pointed out that my nose was bleeding. When the teacher returned, she was livid about what happened. I believe she complained to the administration to make sure the sub was never hired again. Story 36, not a teacher, but in 7th grade life science we had a sub. For the first 5 or so minutes of class, he made us do a Kahoot. For anyone who doesn't know, Kahoot is a learning website that lets you take a quiz in a fun way. The only problem was that he told us every answer. Next, we were supposed to be learning about parts of microscope, but instead he got them out and told us to mess around with them, and he broke one of them. After that, he put a video up and ate my teacher's chocolate, then fell asleep for the last half hour or so of class. Needless to say, when our teacher got back and we told her about the sub, he was fired. Story 37, went to sleep for 5 hours. My class was freaking amazing, the sweetest, most thoughtful group I've ever had. When I got back the next day, I asked how the sub was. Me, how was the sub? Them, He was fine. He kind of took a nap for a while. Me, what? What did you guys do? Them, work quietly so that we wouldn't wake him up. Eventually, we ran out of work, so we just had silent reading. Me, for how long? Them, from when we started working until it was time to go outside. I mean, that's a really long time. Look, I'm glad that you guys were so thoughtful. But if something like that ever happens again, please wake the sub up. It's not safe for the sub to sleep. He needed to be awake in case something happened. Then we would have woken him up if we really needed to. But we also figured he probably really needed to sleep. Seriously, the sweetest class ever. Story 38, we legit do not use subs at my school. There are teaching assistants from pre-K kindergarten who will cover in a pinch. But more often than that, we just divide the kids up amongst the other teachers because, yes, it is easier to handle 6 or 7 extra kids for a day than to pick up the pieces after a sub has blown through town. Story 39, I'm not a teacher, but our substitute teacher gave us a task to write a story about any theme we liked. 4th grade, age 10 to 11 at the moment, I was hooked on everything space-related, the planets, the moon landing ECT, too young to even remotely understand any of that. But this didn't hinder me to write a story about Apollo 11. I put my back into it and talked my father into typing it on the computer. Since I would have taken 3 days for that one page, filled with pride, I gave the story to the substitute teacher, and I got it handed back with a line across the paper stating that I didn't wrote that. No questions or anything, just you didn't do this. I know that any form of trying to convince her failed, albeit that no adult person would write even remotely amateurish like I did. Story 41 had an overly aggressive sub come in that couldn't pronounce half of the names correctly and yelled at the class for it. I got off okay from it, but my friends Denise, Blake, Jacqueline, and Aaron really got it bad from this guy. Story 41, I had to go out for surgery early 2019. I arranged for my predecessor, who I worked with for a long time in a different classroom, to take over for 6 weeks. I wrote meticulous lesson plans with song lists and everything, and we had several meetings beforehand. First week, my daughter I teach in a small district. I teach both of my kids comes home and is singing Baby Beluga in the shower, my sub's favorite song to teach. A song not anywhere on my list. Apparently my entire lesson was scrapped, and she spent the whole class teaching this song. So the worst thing that a friend of mine did was to teach my kid a song she'd torture me with for weeks. I found out later she didn't follow any of my lesson plans, which is a pretty common thing no matter what one teaches. Yes, she is still my friend. No, I do not request her as a sub anymore. Story 42, I was a sub at the time, now a teacher, but I heard stories of one sub who fell asleep in the ISS room, and the kids escaped it. This sub was in a car accident and had brain trauma from it. He used to forget where he parked his car and had a bad sense of overall direction. Story 43, not a teacher, of course, but when I was in 5th grade, we had a sub show us the first Scream movie. I have no idea why or how that happened, but some people were not ready for that. Story 44, this actually happened to the teacher in the classroom next door to me. But the sub started ranting about Democrats and talked about the Second Amendment. He took a stapler and told the students to pretend it's a gun. He then set the stapler on one of the desks and said that the gun could sit there for all eternity without hurting anyone as long as no one pulls the trigger. I mean, maybe I could see this conversation happening in a social studies class, given the correct context, but this was in a middle school science class.